Hello. I only know you, 16 years? Not very long. I didn't know you from the time I first met you, but more recently got to know you more. So I'm sure many of you know Philip, and then lots of you don't. And imagine there are lots of questions that you'd like to ask him. So we only have an hour, so we'll see what we can do to discover a little bit more about Philip. So essentially, what brings you here today?
That's an old trick. It takes years of training as a psychotherapist to learn the opening line for any engagement, which is what brings you. Well, I came here almost 50 years ago with Nguyen, not to the town hall. We were in a bed and breakfast on the side of the hill, and then we did a ceremony, and I was initiated at the Beltane ceremony up on the tour there. And when I was there were just a few people. The order was tiny, a few elderly people, and it's terrible. I realise when I say elderly, we're probably my age, I was 18 and I was looking at these old crocs and thinking, gosh, they must be at least 60, Anyway, they were there, and I remember, and I don't think it was a vision. I think it was a conscious piece of me imagining it. I sort of imagined lots of people, very colourful, with children and animal dogs and around in a circle, and thought, wouldn't it be wonderful? And that sort of come true, and so what brings me here is I just love the way when we come together we have, all of you who are old hands who've been here a number of times know, the day flashes by, but it's so rich. We meet so many people, and there's so many smiles and so many connections and so many experiences and extraordinary things that happen. That's what brings me here, which is, I suppose you could say, is joy. Maybe.
And I so get that. Yeah. You've been chosen chief for a long, long time now. Your reign is shorter than Robert Mugabe. I think you've gotten out just in time.
Doesn't feel like it.
For that, I commend you. So I imagine along this journey you've encountered many challenges, and I'd be curious to know what have been your biggest challenges? Maybe in your life, or maybe as chosen chief.
Okay, well, actually, the order has been blessedly challenge-free at one level, in the sense of, what hasn't happened is sort of schisming. The order has given birth to, or has helped other people to form order. Members of the order have gone and formed their own orders. And a very, and often that has, sometimes that's been tricky, because in order to leave a family, you have to turn the family negative. For adolescents to leave, they have to make mum and dad bad in order to get out. Otherwise, why leave? Stay and have free food and washing. So part of the sort of developmental process is you make whatever situation you're in bad in order to allow yourself to press the eject button. So sometimes the sort of processes have occurred when people have formed their own groups, where they've had to do that in order to eject themselves. But the different approach we have is to see hiving off as a creative act. And that's the way life works. We don't want the order to be monolithic. We don't think organizations should be monolithic. There should be there should be a whole ecosystem of different kinds of groupings and so on. And then you reframe it completely, and you see the hiving off as something that's natural and good and normal, rather than some tragedy because some people have left.
Okay. So, what are you most proud of as chosen chief?
Well, I think I think, well, one is, it goes back to that image, when the order was tiny. It's lovely to see, and I know, people say size doesn't matter and, all that stuff, and it's not about quantity and so on. But there's something heartwarming in, I think it's when you realise you're not alone. When you have anything, a disability, a problem, when you find that other people have it, it's you have this sense of connection. Being a druid isn't a problem, of course, but what I mean is that very common. I think probably a lot of people would have this experience of thinking they're kind of wacky and they've got these strange ideas. In fact, I met somebody who came to the summer gathering, and she said to me, I said, "How did you find?" She said, "I couldn't believe it." She said, I've been so concerned about climate change. I've been, I've had all these thoughts about energy and nature and all the rest of it. And I kind of felt I was alone. Surprising, because, you turn on the telly and you see it. But anyway, that's how she felt. And she said, I got into a room and there were hundreds of people who were thinking and talking like me, and I felt I was amongst like minds. She said it was it was absolutely overwhelming, and she was absolutely ecstatic about it. So I think simply seeing the order grow has been terribly satisfying, and of course, because I get to read the Druid reviews, that's one of the tasks that you'll be taking on. There's this, these amazing documents come in the post, which summarise a person's sometimes an entire life, sometimes a spiritual journey, and they recount the Bardic and Ovate and Druid grade, so all in one sweep. Sometimes it's just the Druid grade, but whatever it is, everyone's absolutely unique and different, and it's just wonderful to read. But I suppose in terms of sort of being proud, the course, I think, when I was with Nguyen, it was sort of deliciously random. He had a big old cupboard in the kitchen, and I'd come and see him once a week. I'd take the tube round on the district line to Barons Court when I was going to school, in my school uniform. And, and he would make me a cup of tea, and then he'd go up to a big cupboard, and he'd open it, and he'd have these little roneoed stacks of paper. And he'd say, let's talk about Stonehenge today. And he'd pull that out and sit down. So it wasn't sort of ordered at all. And creating the course was such a magical experience. When I finished putting together the last quest of the Druid grade, I had this funny feeling as I literally finished it. I thought, hang on a minute, it's February the 2nd or something, whatever it was, 5th. And I rushed over to my filing cabinet, and I opened my filing cabinet, and I looked in my passport, because the first Guerci I put together in the mountains in Bulgaria. And so I could see from the Bulgarian visa, when, and it was exactly 7 years to the day. And I was thinking, wow, that's strange. And then, and then I thought, okay, I've finished the course, we should have some kind of certificate. And I thought, what do you say on a certificate like that? And so I closed my eyes. Please, can I get the wording for this certificate? And the phone rang, and it was Dave the Bard on the phone saying, hello, Philip, I've just found this certificate, this old Druid certificate from the ancient order in a bric-a-brac shop. Do you want it? Sure. Yes, please. So, yes.
Oh, wonderful. So, speak.
And I suppose the other thing as well is because the course wasn't planned, it really was, because it took 7 years, it meant people were doing the course while I was writing bits of it further along the line. And letters were coming in, and I would be working on, say, a Guerce in the Ovate grade, and then I'd get a letter from, so this was days before the internet, so I'd get a physical letter in the mail from somebody in the Bardic grade, and they would give a really beautiful quote, and it would fit perfectly in the Guerce that I was writing for the Ovate. So there was this kind of sense of a dialogue going on.
So, if Nguyen was here today, what would he recognise as new about OBOD? What would he be impressed with?
I think he's struggled in his life to kind of be accepted. He really, I think, in his letters to the Times and so on, he felt very much on the fringe of things. I think the way Druidry has moved from the outer reaches of beyond the pale to sort of drifting towards the centre, so that, and I think one of the huge contributions that Ronald has made to Druidry as a movement, really, and to the order as well, has been the serious eye of the historian on it. And so I think, as a historian himself, he would have been terribly pleased to see the way the history of Druidry had been articulated since his time. And of course, I think he'd be delighted to, just to be present in the ceremonies. Yeah, just to see everybody and the colour and the number of people.
And I suppose from a handful to envision over 20,000 members is something just way beyond one's reckoning. It's really, really impressive. So, okay, you followed many esoteric paths, Jainism, sophrology, you had your Bulgarian guru. And what is it that has brought you back to Druidry? How come you're still a Druid, given all of those interesting journeys that you've taken?
Because in a way that journey, like a sort of circular journey, I did leave in the sense of when I met my Bulgarian guru, he was so charismatic, he was so different to Nguyen. Nguyen was, an ordinary person. He was cultured. I ended up, when I wrote his biography, I said, what I realized was that culture was more important than charisma, because charisma just can vanish in a second, but culture is something that is a kind of refinement of the intellect and the soul that stays with you. But at the time when I met this Bulgarian chap, Mikhail Ivanov, he was stunning. He had an aura that sort of stretched, 20 feet either side of him. He was, he looked like Father Christmas, and he was very funny. And I don't know, we had an instant rapport, and so for 7 years I followed him and so on. But it was one of the most instructive periods, because I saw the problem of when a spiritual way centers around a person, the guru chela situation, and the kind of distortions that can occur and the problems go. I mean, basically you have thousands of people in love with one person, and the projections and the disappointments and the jealousies and all the rest of it are unbelievable, especially when people are trying to be spiritual. So everybody's desperately trying to be nice to each other and spiritual, and so all this stuff is repressed, which makes it even more unhealthy, so it's really tricky. There's been a whole slew of really fascinating documentaries recently on the television. I mean, Netflix has got the Bikram one, which is fantastic to watch. It's got Wild Wild Country about Osho. There's some really interesting films that demonstrate that. What was the question?
What brought you back to Druid?
Oh, I see. Yes. What literally brought me back, do you know something? What brought me back was, because what happened then in those 70s, it all became so weird in the ashram that I decided to leave the guru. We sort of got divorced, and it was like getting a divorce. I mean, it's very, for those of you who've had a guru and then left, it's an extremely uncomfortable experience. And I thought, I've got to do what I always wanted to do from a young age, which is become study psychology. So I did a BSc. So that was like hitting the ground, from 30,000 feet, bang. And if you do a science degree in psychology, it's like, oh. And I did that, and I was doing it for about 2 years or a year and a half or something when I had this experience of Nguyen coming to me. He died 9 years previously. And suddenly he was there in the room with me, and he said, look at all this Druid material again. It's not anachronistic. It's really relevant to the times we are in today. It's absolutely relevant. And so that's what brought me back. And when I came back to it, I realized its relevance, and then a whole string of extraordinary synchronistic experiences which continued to happen, right up to the time of the certificate and beyond, these all extraordinary synchronicities over years, really. And the way, even though I'm fascinated by other paths, and I've recently created a book, Seek Teachings Everywhere, that is a collection of essays about different spiritual paths and their relationship to Druidry. It's like Druidry is my kind of anchor, because it's rooted in these lands, because it's really rooted to the earth and nature. That's my anchor. And then, so when I study other things like sophrology or Jainism, which seem so different and are in some ways, but there's always a thread, there's a way. I mean, for instance, so I'm reading about Jainism, for instance, and and I learn how they have this practice of facing the directions, standing up, meditating, facing the directions, and then. Of course, as you find in Indian stories, that they stand for a month facing the east and a month facing, and so on. So it gets very exaggerated, but it's there, and you think, aha, there we have the same ideas,
So, Olivia Robertson, whom we both knew and loved, was one of your teachers. What did you learn from her?
Yes, this was a lovely little detail that Pat Booker, when she was writing an article, I hadn't sort of realised it, but both I, Eimear and Nguyen have both known Olivia Robertson, who was a kind of key figure for us. So it's a nice kind of continuity of inspiration, I suppose. And I met Olivia in Nguyen's house at a Samhain ceremony when I was 16. And she invited me to her castle in Ireland, and I went there and just fell in love with it, and everybody there, the family who lived there. Went back when I was 18 after I started a term at university, and they invited me to stay. And the choice between staying in a castle in Ireland where everybody meditated every day and did magical rituals in the gardens outside, and being at university, it was a sort of no-brainer, really. But I said, I said, I can't. How can I stay? I mean, I can't stay here forever. And Poppy, which is Olivia's sister-in-law, just looked me straight in the eye and she said, "You can stay here forever." And I felt my whole world spinning around, literally. It was like the floor started to spin. And I said yes. And so I dropped out of university and stayed there. And sort of imbibed Olivia's philosophy. And there were, a couple of things, I think a couple of her influences that have really stayed with me. One was her eccentricity. She was never ashamed to be eccentric and enthusiastic. And sometimes, the way we all have that inner critic. And I sometimes, have a part of me and say, "You're being too enthusiastic." Because I'm enthusiastic about everything. If you give me a new kind of coffee or something, I'll tell everybody about this marvellous new coffee that, somebody's into, And so I'm just naturally enthusiastic. And she was always enthusiastic up until her death at 96 or something, And enthusiastic and eccentric, unashamedly eccentric. And then the other thing is she had this, she when I was at the castle, she said, "Philip, we live by a rule here, which is the reverse Occam's razor principle." And, Occam's razor is this rule in science that you always go for the simplest, most elegant explanation, because, if the door flies open now, it'll be because there's a draft. But Olivia says, no, the reverse Occam's razor principle is how you should run your life, which is you should always look to the most romantic, the most florid kind of explanation. So the door has opened because 3 ghosts have walked in, and 3 of the ancestors have walked in and wished to advise us. And so, do you see what I mean? And that's a fantastic principle to work by. Infuriating to scientists. Yeah.
I suppose this brings me to my next question. You and I are both psychologists and psychotherapists. But one of the whips that I get beaten with within psychology is how important it is to be a scientist and a scientist practitioner. And even though psychology is the study of the psyche or the soul, but so much of science is a whip that we get beaten with. How do you marry, the science of psychology with awareness of guides, spirits, and your spiritual path? How do you weave your way between the two?
Yes, because that's I suppose my real interest is this sort of meeting place. You know the wonderful symbol on the chalice well, on the well of the two circles that intersect, and then you've got this wonderfully fertile fish shape or vulva shape at the centre where the two circles overlap. So for me, my two circles are psychology and spirituality, and where they overlap is just fantastic, fascinating terrain for me. And I think the first thing to bear in mind is that psychology isn't one thing. Even the science of psychology isn't one thing. But if we take it as a kind of spectrum, you've obviously got the marriage of psychology and spirituality in, say, transpersonal approaches and Jungian approaches is clear. So that's easy to reconcile and to work with. If you go over the other end of the spectrum of psychology down to the hard end, if you like, say neuroscience at the end. I mean, the study of neuroscience is just fabulous because you start to see how they're starting to prove what mystics have been talking about for thousands of years. The way we rewire our brains by the way that we think and what we habitually imagine and so on. And so the value of meditation, the value of visualization, imagination is absolutely concrete and physical and real. So if we stay down the hard end, you get to say something like behavioral therapy and CBT and stuff like that. And you say, well, that's how on earth can you reconcile or connect something as hard-nosed as that with spirituality? Well, you can see it happening already with mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy, where they've discovered that they can bring in these concepts from Buddhism into CBT, and it makes a very fertile mix. So actually, it's not a problem at all, actually.
I remember when I was doing yoga, one of our psychology journals had an article on the benefits of alternative nostril breathing on depression or something. And I was so excited, and Mary Ellen, look at this, this is science is proving this. And she looked at it and she said, we've known this for 4,000 years. I thought,
Have you ever tried telling a client who's suffering from, have you tried breathing through alternate nostrils?
no. No. So, I think this is, given I suppose where we are today in the world, and what would you see as the role of Druidry moving forward into the future, given what we're, with the climate emergency and what we're dealing with today?
Well, this is where I think we can, rather than calling on the scientist or the rational mind that is attempting to see into the future, which of course we desperately want to do, in our own lives and in the lives of humanity and the planet. So we get scientific data coming in and we go, oh my God, and then we hear a little story about how somebody's got some great green project, and we say, oh, thank God for that, and so on. And we're constantly kind of adjusting our vision of the future and what's going to happen. In a global sense, we do that in a personal, individual sense as well. Like, I'm feeling great today. I think I might possibly live to the age of my mother, who's 96 now, 97. And then, the next day I'll wake up and I'll be sort of coughing. I'll think, oh, crikey, I'm probably really ill. I'm probably going to die tomorrow. And, and so in our individual lives, we're doing that. Rather than taking that route, because none of us, James Lovelock kept changing his mind. I don't know if you're aware of how, towards the end of his life, at one point, I think it was about 6 years or something before he died, the guy who came up with the Gaia hypothesis said, we've gone beyond the tipping points, it's too late, you may as well enjoy the party because the party's going to be over, so just do whatever you like, doesn't matter. And then, bizarrely, as he got old, as he got into his 90s, maybe that explains it, although that's unfair, is that he said, that he thought that the robots would take over the world. And that's what Hariri, the guy who's written about, so some people have a vision of a kind of dystopian scientific future. My sort of feeling is it's unlikely to be that, actually. I think the state of the world will mean that a dystopian scientific future is unlikely, and probably a utopian scientific future as well, quite honestly. But let's use instead our bardic lens or skills, the bardic self, which and just let me just say a few thoughts that I've had that occur to me. And I'm not saying that they're true. I'm not saying they will come to pass. And in whatever I say does not deny absolutely the necessity for activism, for every attempt possible to regenerate our planet, to restore the planet, to save species. Of course, that must be of absolute primary concern. But there's a way in which, in the Dharmic traditions, there's this ancient teaching about the cycles of time. And in the Hindu tradition, they're called yugas. In the Jain tradition, they're called utsapini and some other word that I can't remember. And these are vast cycles of time. And what they say is we're in the downward arc, and things are just going to get more and more difficult until there'll be very few people left on the earth. So that's the bad news. The good news is the cycle continues, and in the upward arc, things are restored, the earth is restored, and we move into an unimaginably beautiful future. So at one level, you could say it's a question of perspective. If you look from this level, the level of the moment now, the perspective is extremely gloomy. If you track back and you look in terms of thousands and thousands of years, perhaps this can give us some small comfort, this perspective. There's another thought that occurs to me is around, the way in our individual lives, and this is something that was articulated by Peter Russell, who wrote a book called A White Hole in Time about 20 years ago, talking about all of this, funny. The way we live a lot of our lives thinking that we're not going to die, at least some of us, and then as you get older, there's this dawning realization, and then your friends start to pop off and all the rest of it, and it becomes increasingly obvious that despite whatever you might have thought, you are actually going to snuff it too. And and there's a part, can you locate that part in yourself that says, it shouldn't really apply to me? It shouldn't really apply to me. It's a mad thought. In a way, I think it's a distortion of our connection with our sense of that we are eternal, immortal souls. So in a way, you've got that realization that you are eternal in some profound way as part of, and then it goes through all the sort of layers of the personality till you get to this little sort of narcissistic, childlike person who says, well, it shouldn't happen to, I shouldn't die, But we all know it's going to happen, but we kind of put it off. And as Jonathan Franzen, the novelist, says, we all know we're going to die, but we also need, if you've got a choice between thinking about your death and breakfast, you're probably going to think about breakfast, because that's the way we're sort of wired, Now, the interesting thing is that story that we recognize in our own lives now applies outside of us as well. And this is the scary, terrifying, extraordinary fact that we all knew the Earth was going to die. We all knew humanity was going to die. When the sun becomes a red dwarf or whatever it is, So the story wasn't going to go on forever. It's just suddenly the timeline has changed. And there are people who say, oh, well, I feel sorry for the children, because nothing's going to, I'm all right. But it's my kids. Well, unless you're in your 90s, that's probably not true, actually. So what happens if when you at an individual level, when you work with the thought, I shouldn't die, and you think, well, that's a silly thought, that doesn't kind of work. Okay, and you kind of accept the fact that you're going to die, some people can actually really work with that, and it can produce a change in consciousness. They can become less self-centered, more loving, more open, because an awareness of transience, there's something incredibly poignant and beautiful about transience, being aware of that. Likewise, it's possible that in people becoming increasingly aware of the transience of life on Earth, perhaps they'll become more loving and less self-centered. I think the risk is tipping into fear, that people tip into fear and panic and rage. And all those emotional responses are totally understandable, of course. And I think in a way, the role of a spiritual way, a spiritual teaching, a spiritual movement, is to perhaps give that message of saying, look, this is back to your question about the role of Druidry. I know things look really bad, and they are really bad from this perspective. But take heart. Let's be together. Let's not just think of ourselves, but work together.
Great.
And of course, Druids are so involved in conservation movements, in Extinction Rebellion, and all, and they always have been in a way. And isn't it amazing? I saw, the way with the general election coming up, and Labour says they'll plant X million trees, and so on. Everybody wants to plant trees, and what have we been going on about for the last 50 years?
So this comes almost to the end. So hopes, I think you've kind of touched on it. Do you want to develop that any further about what hopes have you for the future? There's also your future.
Yeah.
What are you going to do come next June? And also for where we're going. Maybe you've already dealt with that one. It's a very hard one, but where are you going?
That was a long question.
Yeah.
You've lost me.
I suppose it's the Irish. Around the future, your future, where are you going?
Okay.
Like, is there life after chosen chief of OBOD? I need to know that.
Yes, it's in your interest to know the answer to this question. Well, I'll try and, if I can, link it to this bigger story about, the planet and the destiny of humanity, or if I can, which is, what we're called upon is to live in uncertainty at the moment. All of us, humanity, live in uncertainty. It's a bit like, when somebody has a diagnosis of an illness, and you don't know, you always knew everybody's going to die anyway, but suddenly there's this, but you have to live in uncertainty. And living in uncertainty is extremely uncomfortable, and it creates anxiety. And I suspect, I don't know if there's been any research in it, but the incredible increase of anxiety, particularly amongst young people, I would imagine is connected to this. I mean, when we were young, we lived with the anxiety of the nuclear annihilation. I remember so clearly I was in the courtyard at school. I was in, if you can imagine, it's like I was by Westminster Abbey, and you've got the what is it? Not the Big Ben, but the other one, the other tower, the House of Lords Tower, whatever that thing is, and the courtyard. And I remember all the air raid sirens going off in London. And I just had that, that total panic feeling. Nobody had told me that they were just testing the air raid siren. It was a test, But we, it had drummed into me the 5-minute warning. And then you've got 5 minutes to avoid nuclear holocaust, and you're right by the Houses of Parliament. So everyone's targeted straight there. So in a way, but I think young people now. Anyway, and lots of people, everybody has that anxiety, I think, about the future. That's the negative side of it. The positive side about living in uncertainty is it's incredibly fertile. And, anyone involved in the creative process, and, all of us, going through the OBOD work knows about it. There's a wonderful phrase that Newen wrote, which I've put in the Bardic West. The darkness is the fosterer of splendor. And it's like going into the darkness of the unknown, going into the... when we do ceremonies, if you're able to get complete darkness, say in the midwinter ceremony that's coming up, the way if you're doing it, you extinguish all the lights, and you pause, and then you just you really allow yourself to be in the uncertain realm of darkness, and then you light the single candle. And in create, one of the interesting things about aspects of creativity is that. If you can allow yourself to not know, then I believe, my experience of creativity, I think lots of people, is that, as Grayson Perry says, then the little furry creatures can come out of the forest into the clearing to inspire you. So that it's in global terms. I think if we can, again, that's something that we can do in terms of individually and collectively allowing ourselves to sit in a place of not knowing. Because the place of panic, when I was following this guru 40 years ago, he had this thing about what he called les événements, the events, the coming events. And he scared all of us stiff by saying, there's going to come a time when you won't be able to eat the fish in the sea, when and he gave this sort of, and so people in the ashram weren't studying at college, they weren't painting. I remember talking to somebody and she wasn't painting her house because, what's the point? Les événements are coming, the events are coming, and we'll all be, So it's paralyzing. So somehow to live in that uncertainty. So in answer to your question personally, what Stephanie and I are going to do is after we've handed over when I've handed over the role, a hot air balloon is going to come above Glastonbury. We're going to climb into the basket and say goodbye. It's going to float up. And we're going to allow ourselves a period of not knowing. Well, actually, you know what we're going to do? We're going to take off into Europe. We're going to go in Europe without a schedule. And we don't know how long that will be. We may come after 2.5 weeks. We might say, let's go home. Yes, let's come home. Or maybe we'll stay 3. We have so many friends, and we met so many amazing people in the order, and friends and so on, all over the world, that we can easily meander. And the thing that's dogged us, and I suppose most people as well, over the last 30-something years, is you're somewhere. We're with you in Ireland. And we think, wouldn't it be nice to stay and go and explore? Oh no, we're supposed to be in Berlin tomorrow. So there's always the next thing that you have to do. To not have the next thing to do, it's going to be an absolute luxury. And then, of course, it's very difficult for me to stay in the place of not knowing. So I have a list, as long as your arm, of books I want to write and workshops I want to do and all the rest of it. But
I'm sorry. But we'll cross that bridge.
It's interesting, that not knowing position, because as therapists we work from a the way I was trained as a psychotherapist, that not knowing, non-expert position, and allowing people to live with that not knowing, but then to live as fully as you can for as long as you can, and not give up.
And which leads me to, and that idea connects with that idea of, that Paracelsus' phrase, in every person there is a heaven whole and unbroken, which was a kind of guiding light we used in psychosynthesis therapy training. So when you're with a client, however messed up they are and depressed and freaked out and all the rest of it, you look at them and you believe that in them is a heaven whole and unbroken. So you have, if you like, bifocal vision. So you're not in denial of the suffering, but you're also not in denial of their soul and their spirit. And I think that's how we have to relate to the environmental crisis as well, is to have that bifocal vision. So not to be in denial about the terrible challenges and stresses that the Earth and humanity and species are under, not to be in denial about that, but to also hold to the vision of heaven on Earth, the vision of heaven inside, and to a belief in other planes of reality, because the bottom line goes like this. If you're, do you believe in the other world? So if you say yes, I guess most Druids probably do. Do you believe in other planes of existence? Yes. Are you a materialist? No. I believe there's something more than just matter. I believe that matter is contained within, or is a manifestation of consciousness and soul and the divine, or whatever it is. If you believe all these things, then even worst case scenario, humanity is wiped out, and somehow evolution will continue. The evolution of consciousness will continue, and will, occur in other dimensions and on other planets and so on. If you really believe that, which is the same thing you face when you're dying. It's like, do you really believe you have a soul, or as you die, do you think, well, actually, I'm just a body and it's going, so I'm. And of course, we can never know at the rational level, but at an experiential level, I think when you've tasted experiences of the soul, when you've had experience of altered states of consciousness, sure, they can be illusions, but one of the benefits of the altered state of consciousness that tells you that eternity and infinity exists, and that this is only linear time and all the rest of it, is that you get to a sense that even if it's not true, it doesn't matter. Do you see what I mean? Because it's a weird benefit of the transcendental state, is you're so relaxed and joyful that even if somebody said to you, somebody whispered in your ear, actually, this is it, there's nothing else, you'd kind of be okay with that. Well, at least that's my experience. Does that make sense?
Also because it's recycling.
Yeah.
Because it's recycling, if you're joyful when you're being recycled, isn't that good that everything that's coming back to be formed is going to be more joyful than going out going, ah!
Yes, you're not attached to
No, exactly.
yourself. If any aspect of you is going, that's okay.
There may be less arthritis in the next incarnation. So I suppose for me, is we all need hope. And I used to work as a nurse and working with people who are dying with terminal illness. And then with Howard's last journey, hope was there, even though we knew he was going. But there's still that, knowing you're going, you can still have a hope for the rest of your life here and beyond. And yeah, delusion can be good.
Well, I think that's so, and for a long time I didn't talk about these thoughts, what we've been talking about for this last sort of 15 minutes, because I've thought that it can, that people who aren't aware or hadn't thought about the possibilities of, but now that the change is so rapid, just in the last, 6 months, these thoughts are not are common. Lots of people are having them. It doesn't make sense not to talk about it in order to kind of protect people who might go into a place of despair. You might have pushed them into a state of despair and all the rest of it. But there was one other thing I wanted to say, yes, which is you can see hope and despair as sort of twins, and I think there's another place you can go to, which is perhaps worth cultivating, which is neither hope nor despair, because both of those, in the context we're talking about, are predicated on thinking about the future. So hope suggests, don't worry, it's going to be okay in the end. Despair is, no, it's not. It's all really messed up. So it's that's based on a sense of linear time, and you're projecting forward. There's a way in which, when you go into the heart, into consciousness, you can reach it. It's essentially the now, the moment that transcends past and future. And the problem, although of course it's hugely important to think about the future, otherwise we might not get any lunch, and terribly important to think about the past, to learn from it and to enjoy reminiscence and so on. However, we all know that what is happening is in the now, and it's really important, and that something happens. It's not about denial. So I'm not saying one should always live in the now and deny. But what happens is we so easily get caught in either in rumination about the past, all the things that went wrong and all the cock-ups and all the rest of it that happened, and that's where you get worry and depression. Or you're drawn into the future, and then you're worried about, is it going to be okay or not okay? And that provokes anxiety, because you don't actually know. If you go into the now, you then have more chance of being helpful to something. You know, like in a therapy session, if you're sitting there as a therapist thinking, oh my God, this person's in a mess, this is pretty hopeless. That's not a good or helpful thought for you to have. And it's not helpful also to be thinking about their past. I wonder if it was their dad that made them think like that, and maybe their mother, the best way to be of help is to be totally in the now with them and open to the kind of inspiration that it will bring. So yes, beyond hope and despair, to that other point.
Now.
The now.
Thank you, Philip.
Thank you. And thank you.